The first splash landed on Jacob Reynolds, the man who later rebranded himself as Jacob Kingsley, and the entire table fell silent. My father turned his head slowly, his eyes traveling from the droplets darkening his custom Italian wool to my face, and in that moment I watched something shift behind his gaze. It was contempt pure, and distilled the kind that had shaped my entire childhood without ever being spoken so nakedly in public. My hand still held the water pitcher steady because I had trained myself over years of service to never let my grip falter. But inside my chest, something cracked open. 28 years of silence pressed against my throat, demanding release. I did not know then that I was about to destroy everything he had built over 3 decades with nothing but the truth he thought I was too stupid to understand. The Heritage Global Gala at Silvercrest Hall represented the pinnacle of Pacific Northwest wealth and influence. Sophisticated lighting caught the reflective surfaces of the room, where tech investors and regional billionaires exchanged pleasantries over champagne. A jazz quartet played softly near the fountain entrance, their melodies barely audible beneath the hum of conversations worth millions of dollars. The servers moved through the room like ghosts balancing trays and refilling glasses without ever making eye contact longer than necessary. We existed to facilitate comfort, not to participate in it. I had worked at Silvercrest for 18 months, saving every spare dollar for my master's program in corporate ethics at Seattle University. The irony of studying business integrity while serving water to men who bent every rule in the book was not lost on me, but I needed the money, and I refused to ask my family for a single cent, not after everything. Not after Jacob Reynolds made it clear that his daughter would never amount to anything worth investing in. My manager had assigned me to the VIP section that night because 2 servers called in sick and we were short-staffed. Under normal circumstances, I worked the periphery handling the East Wing, where pharmaceutical executives and mid-level entrepreneurs gathered. The VIP tables sat at the center of the ballroom, and tonight, my father occupied the most prominent seat among them. Jacob Reynolds had reinvented himself since I left Portland. He went by Kingsley, now attached to a logistics empire that stretched across 3 states. The local business journals called him a visionary, a self-made titan who transformed a modest trucking operation into an international shipping concern. His photograph appeared in charitable newsletters and industry publications, always showing that same practiced smile I remembered from childhood, the one that never quite reached his eyes. I watched him enter the ballroom surrounded by associates and potential partners, his silver hair swept back perfectly, his handshake firm and lingering, just long enough to convey authority without desperation. Ethan trailed behind him like a shadow in an expensive suit, my older brother playing the role of heir apparent to a throne built on foundations I was beginning to suspect were made of sand. The investors clustered around my father's table included Marcus Levy from New York, whose fund managed several billion in tech ventures, a German industrialist named Werner Hoffmann, and a Spanish shipping magnate called Alejandro Vega. A young female entrepreneur named Stephanie Park completed the group her sustainable packaging company, apparently on Jacob's radar for acquisition. They spoke in the language of deals and projections, a dialect I had learned to translate during my years in linguistics and international business programs that my family never knew I completed. I approached the table with my pitcher of ice water, keeping my movements smooth and professional. My co-workers had taught me that wealthy guests preferred invisibility in their servants, and I had perfected the art of being present without existing. Jacob Kingsley glanced up as I neared his eyes, passing over me with the same regard he might give a piece of furniture. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of connection. To him, I was simply another faceless worker in a uniform. Ethan caught my eye and his lips curled slightly. My brother knew exactly who I was, and the knowledge that I stood here serving water to our father's business associates clearly amused him. He did not speak, did not acknowledge our relationship, merely observed with that familiar smugness I had grown up beneath. I remember being 6 years old and overhearing my father tell our neighbor that Ethan would carry the family legacy while Maya would be lucky to find a decent husband. I remember being 12 and winning the regional Spanish competition, only to return home and find my trophy placed in the garage beside the recycling bins, while Ethan's basketball participation ribbon hung framed in the living room. I remember being 16 and working 2 jobs after school so I could afford SAT prep books because my father refused to pay for anything he deemed unnecessary for a girl who would never need a college degree. Those memories played through my mind as I poured water for Stephanie Park, then moved to Marcus Levy, then Werner Hoffman. Each pour was measured precise, invisible. I reached for Jacob's glass and he shifted suddenly, gesturing broadly to emphasize some point about market expansion, and his elbow connected with my forearm. The water splashed across his sleeve. A few drops landed on the tablecloth. The conversation died, instantly silenced by the wet droplets. Jacob looked at the wet fabric, then lifted his gaze to meet mine for the first time that evening. His expression shifted from surprise to recognition to something darker and more familiar. "Well," he said loud enough for the entire table to hear, "this is exactly why I never encouraged my daughter to pursue anything beyond basic employment. She cannot even pour water correctly." The silence deepened. I felt every eye at the table turning toward me, reassessing, categorizing. The waitress who had just spilled water on one of the evening's most prominent guests was apparently also his daughter. The social calculus shifted visibly across their faces. "An uneducated waitress," Jacob Kingsley continued, warming to his audience. "This is what happens when children refuse to follow sensible guidance. They end up serving drinks to the people they should have been networking with." Ethan laughed, a small sound that carried poisonous familiarity. Werner Hoffman looked uncomfortable. Alejandro Vega studied his napkin. Stephanie Park watched me with an expression I could not quite read. "Useless," Jacob said, shaking his head. "Absolutely useless. Low-class behavior from someone who should know better." The words landed like physical blows, each one striking a wound I had spent years trying to heal. I stood frozen, the pitcher growing heavy in my hands, feeling myself shrink back into the silent child who had learned that speaking up only brought more criticism, more dismissal, more evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. But something else stirred beneath the old shame. Something that had been building for years through late nights, studying German grammar and Mandarin characters, through double shifts at the bakery and the bookstore, through graduation ceremonies where I walked alone because no one from my family bothered to attend. The fear that had governed my relationship with this man began to transform into something else entirely. I set the water pitcher down on the table. The movement was quiet but deliberate, and it drew attention precisely because it deviated from the expected script of a humiliated servant retreating. "Are you sure you want me to respond to that?" I asked. My voice did not shake. The words came out clear and measured, carrying across the table like a different kind of splash, one that wet everyone present with unexpected possibility. Jacob's eyebrows rose. He was not accustomed to challenges, certainly not from me, and not in front of people whose respect he desperately needed to maintain. The German investor leaned forward slightly. The Spanish magnate set down his wine glass. Stephanie Park tilted her head with unmistakable interest. I felt the weight of 28 years pressing against my chest, demanding release, demanding acknowledgement, demanding that I finally speak the truth I had been carrying in silence. My father had built an empire on the assumption that no one would ever question him, that his daughter would remain forever small and invisible and compliant. He was about to discover how wrong he had been. "You think I will bow my head the way I have for 28 years, I said softly, holding his gaze. "But tonight, I am going to say the thing you fear most, the truth." Standing there beneath the dazzling lights, watching my father's contempt settle across his features like a familiar mask, I felt the past rush forward with the force of a broken dam. Every dismissal, every slight, every moment of being erased within my own family played through my mind as though projected onto the silk walls of that ballroom. The humiliation he had just delivered was not new. It was simply the public performance of a dynamic that had shaped my entire existence. My family lived in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Portland, Oregon, where the houses sat close together and the neighbors knew everyone's business before breakfast. Our home was always tidy because my mother cleaned obsessively, channeling her anxieties into spotless floors and organized cupboards. The atmosphere inside those walls, however, carried a perpetual tension that no amount of dusting could address. Jacob Reynolds spoke with the authority of someone who believed his opinions were natural law. His voice filled every room he entered, deciding matters large and small without consultation or compromise. When he declared that Ethan would attend business camp while I would stay home to help with household chores, the decision simply existed, immutable as weather. "Maya does not have the temperament for leadership," he told my mother once while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to focus on homework. "She is too quiet, too uncertain. Ethan has the fire." I learned early that fire in our family meant something specific: aggression, confidence, the willingness to dominate conversations and dismiss opposing views. I possessed none of these qualities, preferring to observe rather than announce, to consider rather than conclude. In my father's taxonomy of human value, this made me fundamentally defective. The neighborhood reinforced his assessment. During summer barbecues and holiday gatherings, adults would cluster around Ethan asking about his sports achievements and his plans for the future. They called him sharp and destined for great things. When they addressed me at all, the compliment was always the same: "Such a sweet girl, so well behaved, so helpful to her mother." Helpful. The word became a cage. By age 10, I was responsible for watching younger cousins at family events, for clearing tables and washing dishes, while Ethan played video games with the other boys. By 12, I spent my summers doing laundry and yard work, while my brother attended junior leadership programs funded by our father's business connections. My mother existed in a space of perpetual accommodation. Eliza Reynolds loved her children. I never doubted that. But she had surrendered her voice somewhere in the early years of her marriage and never quite recovered it. When I showed her my first poetry attempts, she smiled sadly and tucked the papers into a drawer where my father would not find them. When I begged to attend language camp instead of helping Aunt Ruth with her daycare, my mother simply shook her head. "Your father would not approve," she said. And that was the end of every conversation. The discovery of my gift happened by accident. I was 11, flipping through television channels while my parents argued in the kitchen about something I no longer remembered, and I landed on a Spanish language learning program. The sounds captivated me immediately, musical and rhythmic in ways English never seemed to be. I watched the entire episode, then snuck the remote back to its place before anyone noticed. Within a week, I had memorized basic greetings. Within a month, I was checking out Spanish books from the school library, hiding them beneath my assigned reading so no one would ask questions. The language became my secret world, a space where I could grow without permission, without scrutiny, without the constant reminder that I was less than. My 8th grade Spanish teacher noticed my ability before anyone in my family did. Mrs. Rodriguez kept me after class one afternoon and asked where I had learned to conjugate verbs with such accuracy. "Television," I admitted, "and the library." She studied me for a long moment, then wrote something on a slip of paper and handed it to me. It was information about a regional language competition, one that offered small scholarships to the winners. "You have a gift," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." I entered the competition without telling my parents, forged my mother's signature on the permission slip, and won 2nd place against students from schools with actual language programs. The trophy sat hidden in my closet for 3 years before my father found it while searching for something else entirely. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, holding up the small golden figure as though it carried disease. "A language competition," I said. "From middle school." "Waste of time." He dropped it back into the closet. "Focus on practical skills. Languages will not pay your bills." That trophy disappeared 2 days later. I never learned whether he threw it away or simply moved it somewhere I would not find it. The distance between Ethan and me widened throughout high school. My brother received a car for his 16th birthday, used but functional, allowing him to attend networking events and business workshops across the city. I rode my bicycle 3 miles to participate in the debate club because the bus schedule did not accommodate after-school activities. When I brought home straight A report cards, my father glanced at them briefly and returned to his newspaper. When Ethan scraped by with C averages but charmed his way onto the Junior Chamber of Commerce Youth Board, my father threw a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in our neighborhood. "Ethan understands what matters," Jacob announced over steak and baked potatoes. "Connections, relationships, the practical side of success." I sat silent, pushing food around my plate, understanding finally and completely that academic achievement meant nothing in our household. My father had decided long ago that I would amount to nothing significant, and he interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens, discarding anything that contradicted his conclusion. The acceptance letter from the linguistics program arrived during my senior year, along with a partial scholarship that would cover most of my tuition. I had applied in secret using the school counselor's office to submit materials and a friend's address for correspondence. When I finally told my parents, hoping perhaps that concrete success might shift their perspective, my father's response crystallized everything I had always suspected. "You think you can survive in that world?" he asked, not even looking up from his television. "You will drop out within a semester. Save yourself the embarrassment." Ethan smirked from the couch. My mother said nothing. I moved out 3 weeks later with 2 suitcases and $400 saved from my part-time job at the bakery. The last words my father spoke to me before I left were not encouraging or affectionate. They were a prediction. "You will come crawling back," he said. "They always do." Standing now in this ballroom at Silvercrest Hall, watching his face flush with anger and confusion as I refused to cower before his public cruelty, I understood finally what all those years had been building toward. He still saw me as the silent child he could dismiss without consequence. He still believed I was the girl who would accept humiliation rather than risk conflict. I had lived an entire life within his shadow, had struggled and scraped and rebuilt myself from nothing while he was busy not noticing. And now before the wealthiest and most powerful people in Seattle, he was about to meet the woman he never knew I had become. "You spent my whole life telling me I was nothing," I said, my voice steady in the electric silence. "But tonight, in front of everyone you are trying so hard to impress, you are about to discover exactly how wrong you were." I had walked away from the house with 2 suitcases and a final prediction ringing in my ears. "You will come crawling back." That prediction, whispered by my father as I left Portland, became the silent engine of my life. The choice to leave was the choice to bet on myself, and I intended to win that bet through sheer, unrelenting effort. My first apartment was a converted garage behind a retired schoolteacher's house in southeast Portland. The space measured barely 300 square feet, contained a hot plate instead of a stove, and required crossing the backyard to access the only bathroom. I loved it with a ferocity that surprised me. For the first time in my life, every inch of territory belonged to me alone. The linguistics program at Portland State challenged me in ways high school never had. My professors expected rigorous analysis, clear argumentation, and original thinking. They criticized my work relentlessly and praised my improvements with equal intensity. In their classrooms, I learned that intelligence was not a fixed quantity, but a practice that strengthened through effort. I survived those first semesters on minimal sleep and strategic meal planning. My mornings began at the campus library, where I could study without paying for heat. Afternoons meant classes and discussion sections. Evenings I spent at the bakery where I had worked throughout high school, now promoted to closing shift manager. Weekends brought additional hours at a used bookstore near the university where the owner let me read during slow periods. The money was never enough. I found satisfaction in resourcefulness rather than comfort. I discovered that the campus food pantry could supplement grocery expenses and that the library kept a list of obscure scholarships. During my second year, I started learning German. A classmate from Berlin offered a language exchange in return for my help with her English essays. Within months, I was reading Goethe in the original, surprised to discover that the grammar made logical sense once I stopped expecting it to behave like English. The decision to add a second major came after a conversation with my academic advisor. She reviewed my transcripts and asked why I had not considered international business. "Your language skills give you an enormous advantage," she said. "Companies need people who can negotiate across cultures." "I cannot afford additional semesters," I admitted. She smiled and pulled out a folder of scholarship applications. "Let me tell you about some opportunities you may have missed." The International Business Program brought new challenges and new friendships. I met Lucy Chen during orientation, a woman from Sacramento, whose parents had arrived as refugees and built a restaurant empire through decades of 18-hour days. Lucy understood struggle in ways my university classmates did not, and our friendship became an anchor. "Family is not always about blood," Lucy told me once over late-night coffee in the student union. "Sometimes you have to build your own." I was building. Every credit hour, every language mastered, every skill developed, added another brick to my foundation. German led to Mandarin, led to Italian, each new language opening doors I had not known existed. My professors began recommending me for research assistantships and conference presentations. Graduate students from the business school sought my help translating documents for their international projects. None of this reached my family. I sent occasional updates to my mother focusing on general wellness. She responded with brief notes that read like transcripts of conversations we had never actually had. Ethan blocked me on social media after I declined his request to help him write a college application essay. My father, as far as I knew, never asked about me at all. The graduation ceremony for my double degree fell on a rainy May afternoon. I walked across the stage alone, accepted my diploma. Alone took photographs of myself using my phone's timer, propped against a bench. Lucy had wanted to attend, but was with her grandmother in California. My professors shook my hand and wished me well. I returned to my apartment and allowed myself to cry for exactly 10 minutes before making dinner. The job offers after graduation disappointed me. Entry-level analyst positions wanted 5 years of experience I did not possess. International firms required relocations I could not afford. I took a position at Silvercrest Hall because the salary was consistent, the hours were flexible, and the tips could fund the remainder of my student loans. My father would have called it proof of his predictions. I called it strategy. The work itself held unexpected education. I learned to read body language, identify hierarchy through seating arrangements, and recognize power dynamics through subtle cues. The wealthy guests who passed through Silvercrest represented a masterclass in influence, and I studied them with the same intensity I had once applied to verb conjugations. I watched men like my father perform confidence they had not earned. I listened to their conversations in German, Spanish, and Mandarin, understanding discussions they assumed were private, absorbing information about deals and disputes. My co-workers noticed my languages eventually. Word spread quietly through the staff that Maya in events could translate for difficult guests. My managers began assigning me to tables where communication challenges might arise. I never volunteered the information, simply allowed my abilities to emerge when useful. The skills felt like armor. Each language represented another layer of protection. I could never be dismissed as ignorant when I understood more than anyone suspected. When I learned that Jacob Reynolds had rebranded himself as Kingsley and would be attending the Heritage Global Gala at Silvercrest Hall, all those years of preparation suddenly had a destination. My father had built his empire, assuming that no one close enough to see his methods would ever have the power to challenge them. He had not counted on his invisible daughter spending a decade preparing for exactly this moment. I looked at my reflection in the staff room mirror, adjusting my uniform, checking my composure. The woman looking back had 2 degrees, 5 languages, and a lifetime of observations. Tonight, for the first time, we would meet as equals, and he had no idea. The months before this gala had carried signs I should have recognized, fragments of conversation caught during service names that surfaced across different tables patterns in the complaints of certain guests. The universe was assembling evidence in front of me while I focused on survival and student loan payments, too tired after double shifts to piece together what I was hearing. My father's reinvention as Jacob Kingsley had not surprised me when I first learned of it. Our family had always treated identity as negotiable, adjusting presentation to match circumstances. What surprised me was the scale of his transformation. The logistics company he now controlled employed hundreds of people across multiple facilities. His name appeared in trade publications and regional business journals. Photographs showed him accepting community service awards and speaking at industry conferences. The Jacob Kingsley who smiled from those glossy pages bore little resemblance to the man who had raised me. This version projected warmth and accessibility, the kind of leader who remembered subordinates' birthdays and asked about their families. I recognized the performance immediately. My father had always understood audiences, had always known how to calibrate his behavior for maximum advantage. The first fragment came from a German-speaking table 3 months before the gala. I was clearing their dessert plates when I heard one executive mention a company called Kingsley Freight in connection with a supply chain dispute. "The numbers do not add up," he said in German, assuming the servers around him were monolingual. Someone adjusted the quarterly reports after the audit. His companion nodded gravely. "We suspected manipulation but could not prove it." I continued clearing plates, my movements steady and unremarkable, while their conversation carved itself into my memory. Kingsley Freight, adjusted reports, audit manipulation. These were serious accusations against a company that I now recognized as my father's enterprise. The second fragment arrived 2 months later from a Spanish-speaking group of shipping executives. They complained about delayed cargo and fraudulent customs documentation about a company that blamed customers for its own failures. "Kingsley plays dirty," one man said, stabbing his steak with unnecessary force. "He has connections in the regulatory offices. Complaints disappear." His colleague agreed. Someone paid to make problems go away. The evidence was obvious. I served their wine without expression, my heart pounding beneath my professional calm. The picture forming in my mind grew increasingly disturbing. These were not isolated complaints or normal business friction. Multiple sources speaking languages they assumed I could not understand were describing patterns of fraud. The third fragment came from a Japanese businessman who left his phone at the table. I was returning it when the screen lit with an email preview that I could not help but read. The subject line mentioned Kingsley Freight and discrepancies in shipping manifests. The preview text contained enough detail to suggest formal investigation. I handed the phone back with practiced politeness. The man thanked me and studied my face for a moment longer than necessary, perhaps wondering whether I had understood what he was seeing. I kept my expression neutral and returned to my station. None of this was my concern. I had severed ties with my family and had built an existence completely separate from their drama. Whatever Jacob Kingsley was doing with his company belonged to his world, not mine. I repeated this to myself constantly during those months, trying to maintain the boundaries I had constructed so carefully. But the information kept finding me. Conversations in German about falsified export documents, discussions in Spanish about payoffs to customs officials, complaints in Mandarin about cargo that never arrived despite records showing delivery. Each fragment connected to the others, building a mosaic of corporate misconduct centered on my father's enterprise. I shared none of this with anyone. Lucy was in California, dealing with family obligations. My coworkers at Silvercrest knew nothing about my background or abilities. The isolation felt protective at first, then suffocating. I was carrying knowledge I had never asked for about a man I had spent years trying to escape. The gala invitation arrived in staff mailboxes with the usual details about scheduling and dress code. Heritage Global Gala, the premier event of the Seattle business season, attended by everyone who mattered in regional commerce. I scanned the guest list and felt my stomach drop. Jacob Kingsley appeared near the top, listed as a featured attendee and potential honoree for his contributions to Pacific Northwest industry. The irony was almost unbearable. The man whose fraudulent practices I had been inadvertently documenting for months would be celebrated that evening among the very investors he had deceived. My manager informed me that I would be covering the VIP section due to staffing shortages, the tables where Kingsley would be seated, the heart of the evening's most important conversations, the precise location where all my accumulated knowledge would become most relevant. I considered calling in sick. I considered requesting reassignment. I considered revealing my connection to Kingsley and letting human resources handle the conflict of interest. Each option would have protected me from confrontation, would have maintained the careful distance I had constructed between my past and present selves. Instead, I accepted the assignment. Perhaps I wanted to see him in his natural habitat, performing success for audiences who did not know what I knew. Perhaps I needed to confirm that the fragments I had collected were real, that my father was indeed the fraud I suspected him to be. Perhaps some part of me that had been silenced for 28 years wanted finally to stand in the same room with him and refused to be invisible. The evening of the gala, I dressed in my uniform with unusual care, making certain every element was perfect. My hair was secured neatly, my shoes were polished, my posture was straight. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a waitress, but a woman who had spent a decade preparing for something she had not known was coming. The ballroom shimmered with wealth and ambition. Champagne flowed. Conversation hummed. The powerful and privileged circulated through their established patterns, acknowledging each other's importance, performing for each other's benefit. And there, at the center of the most prominent table, sat Jacob Kingsley. My father, surrounded by the investors he needed to impress. Speaking languages he assumed no one serving his water could understand. He did not know what I knew. He did not know who I had become. He did not know that the invisible daughter he had dismissed so completely was about to step out of the shadows with years of preparation and mountains of truth. The water pitcher was heavy in my hands as I approached his table. My heart beat steadily calmly, like it was finally doing the job it had been training for all along. Tonight would change everything. The VIP section occupied the exact center of the ballroom, positioned beneath the largest chandelier so that light cascaded down like concentrated attention. The tables here were spaced farther apart than elsewhere, creating islands of exclusivity where conversations could proceed without civilian interference. The guests at these tables had net worths measured in hundreds of millions. Their time cost more per minute than most people earned in hours. I approached with my pitcher, moving through the choreography of service that had become second nature. Step, pause, pour. Each motion was designed to be forgettable, a background function that allowed important people to focus on important matters. The air around my father's table felt different, charged with tension. Jacob Kingsley held court like a king among courtiers, his voice carrying stories of deals closed and competitors vanquished. The investors around him listened with expressions calibrated to convey appropriate admiration. Werner Hoffmann from Munich nodded at strategic moments. Alejandro Vega from Barcelona laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. Marcus Levy from New York watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. Stephanie Park sat slightly apart from the men, observing rather than participating. Ethan occupied the seat to our father's right, playing the role of heir apparent. He saw me approaching, and his lips curled into that familiar smirk. Jacob noticed my arrival only as another disturbance in his peripheral vision. "The European contracts will close next quarter," he was saying. "Our logistics network is unmatched in the Pacific Northwest. When we secure these partnerships, Kingsley Freight becomes unstoppable." I moved around the table, serving the guests in order. I reached for Jacob's glass, and he shifted suddenly, gesturing broadly. His elbow connected with my forearm, and the pitcher tilted. The cold water hit his custom Italian wool jacket. The conversation died instantly. Jacob looked down at his sleeve, then lifted his gaze to mine. The expression shifted from surprise to the familiar darkening contempt that always preceded a verbal storm. "Well," he said loud enough for the entire table to hear, "this is exactly why I never encouraged my daughter to pursue anything beyond basic employment. She cannot even pour water correctly." The silence deepened. I felt every eye turning toward me, reassessing, categorizing. "An uneducated waitress," Jacob continued, warming to his audience. "Useless. Absolutely useless. Low-class behavior from someone who should know better." Ethan laughed. The words landed, but the familiar cruelty no longer brought the sting of shame. Instead, the contempt acted like a switch. The internal mechanism that governed my fear finally snapped, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. The years of silent observation and achievement asserted themselves over the old need to retreat. I was no longer the child who would hide. The fear did not reappear. It simply made room for an undeniable clarity. I set the pitcher down on the table. The movement was quiet but deliberate, a clear deviation from the expected script of retreat. "Are you certain you want me to respond to that?" I asked. My voice came out steady, calm. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge he had not anticipated. Jacob's expression flickered. He was not accustomed to being questioned. His posture adjusted slightly, the body language of a man suddenly uncertain whether he controlled the situation. "Excuse me," he said. "I asked whether you truly want everyone at this table to believe I know nothing." I met his eyes, directly holding his gaze with the same intensity he had used to diminish me. "Because I am happy to demonstrate otherwise." The German investor leaned forward. The Spanish shipping magnate set down his wine. Stephanie Park's head tilted with unmistakable interest. Marcus Levy's expression shifted to active engagement. I had spent my entire life being silenced in rooms full of people who assumed they were more important than me. Tonight I would let them discover what happens when the invisible person in the room knows more than everyone else. "You think I will bow my head," I said quietly, "the way I have for 28 years, but tonight I am going to say the thing you fear most, the truth." The silence that followed my words stretched like a held breath, expanding to fill the space between the dazzling lights and the polished stone floor. Every person at the table had frozen mid-motion wine glasses, hovering forks suspended, attention locked on the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Jacob recovered first, summoning the dismissive laugh I remembered from childhood. It was the sound he made when anything challenged his authority, an acoustic weapon designed to minimize and diminish. "You think you have something worth saying." He gestured at my uniform with barely concealed disgust. "Look at yourself. You are serving water at a party where you should be grateful to have employment. Whatever delusions you are entertaining, they are not welcome at this table." I did not flinch. The woman who would have flinched had died somewhere in the years between leaving Portland and standing here tonight, replaced by someone who had learned that knowledge was power and silence was surrender. I turned to Werner Hoffmann and spoke in clear, precise German. "You mentioned earlier this evening that the quarterly reports from Kingsley Freight contained inconsistencies. You were correct. The numbers were adjusted after the initial audit." Werner's face went pale. His eyes darted to Jacob, then back to me, then around the table, as though seeking an explanation for how a waitress had suddenly started speaking his language. He stopped, collected himself, switched to German. "You understood our conversation, every word." Alejandro Vega had gone very still. I turned to him and continued in Spanish, my accent carrying the fluency of years of study and practice. "And you discussed the shipping delays with your colleague, the cargo that was diverted and the customs documentation that was falsified. Your concerns were legitimate." The Spanish magnate put down his glass with exaggerated care, as though he feared it might explode in his hand. "How is this possible? I had worked here for 18 months. I said, keeping my voice even. I spoke 5 languages fluently. I had heard a great deal that people assumed was private. Jacob had gone from dismissive to confused to something approaching alarm. His mask of confidence was slipping, revealing the uncertainty beneath. "This is ridiculous. She is making things up to embarrass me. Am I switched back to English, addressing the table at large. "I had 2 degrees, one in linguistics from Portland State, one in international business from the same institution. I graduated with honors, magna cum laude." Stephanie Park made a small sound of surprise. Marcus Levy's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. Ethan looked like someone had just informed him the sky was made of cheese. "If you are so educated," Jacob said, his voice hardening, "then why are you pouring water for your living? Why are you not working somewhere respectable?" It was the question he thought would destroy my credibility. Instead, it opened the door to everything I had been waiting to say. "Because I refuse to take a single dollar from anyone who might use it to control me," I said. "I worked through college, multiple jobs. I paid my own way because I learned early that depending on family meant accepting their definitions of who I should be." I paused, letting the words settle. and because I was saving for graduate school, in corporate ethics appropriately enough. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Corporate ethics, spoken to a table full of investors who were beginning to realize they might be seated with a fraud. "You cannot prove anything," Jacob said, but his voice had lost its commanding certainty. "You are just a disgruntled child making accusations." "I have not accused you of anything." I kept my tone calm, almost gentle. "I have simply repeated conversations I overheard. If you have done nothing wrong, then my statements are harmless observations with no bearing on your business." Werner Hoffmann spoke carefully in German, knowing now that I would understand. "The discrepancies in the reports. Can you describe what you heard specifically?" I described the conversation his colleagues had been having 3 months earlier, naming the specific concerns about adjusted figures and audit timing. His face grew more troubled with each detail. Alejandro Vega asked in Spanish about the shipping delays. I provided dates and cargo descriptions that matched complaints his company had filed. His expression shifted from skepticism to recognition to something approaching gratitude. "She is lying," Jacob insisted, but his protest sounded hollow even to himself. "She must have found this information somewhere else. Industrial espionage." "Industrial espionage would require that I sought out this information," I replied. "I did not. I simply understood conversations that people assumed were private. The languages you never bothered to learn were not secret codes. They are spoken by billions of people, including apparently your waitstaff." Stephanie Park leaned forward, her business instincts clearly engaged. "You said 5 languages. Which ones?" "English, German, Spanish, Mandarin, and Italian." "Prove it," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cracking with desperation. "Say something in Chinese. Prove you are not making this up." I turned to him and spoke in Mandarin, delivering a brief but precise summary of everything I had just said about our father's business practices. The tonal language felt natural on my tongue. When I finished, Marcus Levy spoke for the first time in several minutes. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Kingsley, I believe we need to have a different kind of conversation, one that addresses the concerns this young woman has raised." "She is my daughter," Jacob said, the admission forced out like a confession. "She is biased. She has always resented our family's success." "That may be," Marcus replied, "but her bias does not automatically make her wrong, and the specificity of her claims suggests she is not simply inventing grievances." Werner Hoffmann nodded. "I would like to see the original audit reports, the ones before any adjustments were made." Alejandro Vega agreed. "And I want documentation on those shipping delays, the real documentation, not the summaries provided to us." Jacob's face had gone from flushed to pale, the color draining like water from a cracked vessel. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, one that combined recognition and fear in equal measure. "You have no idea what you have done," he said quietly. I met his eyes without flinching. "I have told the truth. If the truth revealed flaws in your foundations, then those flaws were always there." The table erupted into multiple conversations as investors pulled out phones and began contacting their offices. Marcus Levy was already dictating messages to his assistant. Werner Hoffmann was speaking rapid German to someone overseas. Alejandro Vega had moved away from the table entirely, his face grim as he listened to whoever was on the other end of his call. Jacob sat alone in the middle of his own celebration, surrounded by people who were suddenly very interested in verifying everything he had ever told them. I stepped back from the table, my role in the immediate drama concluded. The information I had provided was out there now. Whatever happened next would unfold according to its own logic. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I watched my father's world begin to crumble around him. He had spent 28 years telling me I was nothing. Tonight I had proven them all wrong, and this was only the beginning. The ballroom had transformed into something resembling a crisis response center. Investors clustered in urgent conversations, phones pressed to ears, faces grave with the implications of what they were discovering. The jazz quartet played on obliviously, their elegant melodies providing surreal accompaniment to the collapse of a reputation that had taken decades to construct. I stood near the service station watching without interfering, my heart rate gradually returning to normal. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a strange calm that felt almost like peace. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was beyond my control. Werner Hoffmann approached me first, his bearing formal, but his eyes intense. He spoke in German, perhaps testing whether my earlier demonstration had been a fluke. The conversation you described, my colleagues in Frankfurt, you heard them discussing the audit discrepancies. Yes, they mentioned specific figures that did not match the projections your office had received. And you can recall these numbers. I provided them. His expression shifted from skeptical to troubled. Those are accurate. We will need to conduct our own investigation, a full forensic audit. Alejandro Vega appeared beside Werner, his Spanish rapid with agitation. The shipping delays you mentioned, the cargo that went missing last December, you knew about those specific incidents. I described the conversation I had heard naming the ports involved and the explanations provided versus what his employees suspected. His face darkened with each detail. We filed complaints, he said. They were dismissed as unsubstantiated. Perhaps they will receive different considerations now. Marcus Levy had finished his phone calls and approached with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He spoke quietly, his words meant only for me. You are not simply a disgruntled employee with a grudge. Is your educational background legitimate? Completely. I can provide transcripts. He studied me for a long moment. Your father has been cultivating this investment relationship for 2 years, and you chose tonight of all nights to reveal this information. He chose to humiliate me in front of everyone he wanted to impress. I simply responded with the only weapon I had available, the truth. Marcus nodded, something approaching respect, entering his expression. That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me this evening. Across the room, Jacob remained at his table like a captain, refusing to abandon a sinking ship. Ethan had disappeared somewhere, perhaps seeking reinforcement. The other guests had begun gravitating toward the drama, sensing blood in the water. Stephanie Park approached me next, her manner professional but curious. 5 languages, that is genuinely impressive. And you chose to share this particular information because of how your father treated you tonight. I considered the question carefully. I chose to share this information because people were about to invest substantial money in a company built on fraud. The personal element provided motivation, but the underlying facts would have been true regardless of my family connection. Stephanie studied me. You have wasted considerable talent in this job. I have been preparing for the next stage of my career. Sometimes preparation looks like waiting tables. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Several people in dark suits had arrived, their manners suggesting official business. They spoke briefly with the event coordinator before moving toward Jacob's table with purposeful strides. That was fast, Stephanie murmured. I watched as the newcomers introduced themselves to my father, their credentials producing visible panic on his face. The phrases preliminary inquiry and document preservation carried across the room despite their lowered voices. Ethan reappeared and rushed to his father's side, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He gestured wildly, protesting something, but the suited figures seemed unimpressed. Marcus Levy observed the scene with professional detachment. It would appear that your revelations tonight have accelerated certain processes that were already underway. What do you mean? Investigations like this do not begin from scratch in a matter of hours. Someone had already raised concerns about Kingsley Freight through official channels. Your information tonight simply provided additional context for a case already in motion. I had not considered this possibility. My fragments of overheard conversation might have been confirming suspicions that regulators had developed through their own analysis. The picture was larger than I had realized. The investors who heard you tonight will certainly request independent audits, Marcus continued. The regulatory attention will expand, and your father's reputation will face examination from multiple directions. I did not intend to destroy anyone, I said. I just refused to stay silent when he attacked me. Marcus Levy excused himself to make additional calls. Werner Hoffman was deep in conversation with Alejandro Vega about coordinating their response. Stephanie Park had begun networking, recognizing opportunity in the chaos. I remained at my station watching my father's world begin to crumble around him. The man who had dismissed me had watched his power revealed as performance. His future had been redirected by the words of the daughter he had spent decades ignoring. I had simply stopped protecting him from the truth, and the truth was now doing the rest. The remainder of the gala unfolded like a rapid descent. Structure after structure gave way, carefully constructed facades peeling back to reveal the hollow foundations beneath. I watched from my station near the service entrance, technically still on duty, but effectively obsolete my role in the evening's true drama, having been completed hours earlier. Marcus Levy was the first to officially withdraw. He approached my father's table with the composed manner of someone delivering difficult news he had practiced many times before. Mr. Kingsley, I am suspending all discussions regarding investment until a complete audit has been conducted by independent parties. My attorneys will be in touch regarding the documentation requirements. Jacob attempted to salvage the moment, his salesman's instincts overriding his obvious panic. Marcus, this is a misunderstanding. We can clear this up with a simple conversation. Let me explain. There will be ample opportunity for explanations during the formal review process. Marcus's tone contained no warmth, no room for negotiation. I would advise you to retain legal counsel immediately. The withdrawal triggered a cascade. Werner Hoffman made his announcement next, his German precision leaving no ambiguity about the partnership being terminated. Alejandro Vega delivered his message in rapid Spanish, confirming his withdrawal. Other investors who had been cultivated over months and years approached Jacob. Each conversation followed the same pattern: suspended negotiations, pending investigations, attorneys to be contacted. The deals that were supposed to secure my father's legacy were dissolving in real time. Ethan tried to intervene, tried to charm, tried to perform the role of capable successor. His efforts were almost pitiable. He lacked the vocabulary to address complex business concerns because he had never actually learned how his father's company operated. His confidence collapsed each time someone asked a technical question he could not answer. "You do not actually run anything, do you?" one investor observed. "You are simply the face they put on presentations." Ethan had no response. His identity as the successful Kingsley heir was being stripped away layer by layer, revealing a young man who had been given everything and earned nothing. I watched this unfold without satisfaction. The destruction of my brother's unearned confidence simply exposed the hollowness of what I had envied. The event coordinator approached me. "Maya, I need you to continue service in the West Wing. We are trying to maintain some appearance of normalcy for the other guests." Of course. I picked up a fresh pitcher and returned to work, moving through tables of wealthy strangers who had come for an evening of networking and found themselves witnesses to corporate upheaval. Their conversations buzzed with speculation and gossip. "Did you hear what happened at the Kingsley table? Apparently, his daughter works here, as a waitress. She spoke 5 languages, caught him in lies he did not know she understood. Regulatory people showed up within hours. Someone must have been building a case already." The story was spreading through the room like ripples in water, each retelling adding layers of drama and implication. By morning, it would be on social media. My father's reputation would be subjected to scrutiny he had never anticipated. The regulatory officials spent over an hour with Jacob before departing with boxes of documents and assurances of follow-up meetings. Their presence alone told other guests everything they needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. The ballroom manager found me during a quiet moment. "Maya, what you did tonight took extraordinary courage. I may have caused problems for the venue. You told the truth to people who needed to hear it. Your performance here has been exemplary, and you will have a reference from this establishment whenever you need it." The kindness surprised me. "Thank you," I managed. "Go home when you are ready. You have done enough for one evening." I finished my shift anyway, processing everything that had happened. The confrontation, the revelations, the cascade of consequences. In the span of a few hours, I had transformed from invisible background worker to the central figure in a scandal that would reshape multiple lives. Jacob found me as I was preparing to leave. He had aged visibly since the beginning of the evening, his face lined with stress that no amount of expensive grooming could conceal. "You have destroyed everything," he said. His voice was quiet, almost wondering. I told the truth. If the truth destroyed something, then its foundation was weak. "You had no right. You forfeited any claim to my silence when you humiliated me in front of everyone you wanted to impress." He stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. The invisible daughter he had dismissed for 28 years had become visible in the most catastrophic way possible. "Your brother will lose everything because of you. Ethan will lose things he never earned. Perhaps that will be the making of him. It certainly was the making of me." I walked past my father and out of the ballroom through the service corridor into the cool night air that carried the scent of impending rain. The city stretched before me, shimmering and indifferent. I had done something irreversible tonight. The consequences would ripple outward for months and years. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, but triumph was not what I felt. Only the strange, empty peace of having finally spoken after a lifetime of enforced silence. The rain began as I reached the bus stop. I stood in it without seeking shelter, letting the water wash away the stress of the evening. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new revelations, new challenges. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had stopped hiding, stopped pretending, stopped accepting the limitations others had tried to impose on her. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I was completely and unapologetically myself. The morning after the gala arrived, gray and relentless, matching my exhausted state perfectly. I had slept perhaps 3 hours, my mind cycling through the events of the previous evening. The confrontation, the revelations, the look on my father's face when he finally understood who I had become. My phone had accumulated notifications overnight, the screen bright with messages and alerts I was not ready to address. I made coffee first, the ritual of grinding beans and heating water providing a temporary anchor in a world that had shifted beneath my feet. The news had traveled fast. My social media accounts, largely dormant for years, showed dozens of friend requests and messages from people I did not recognize. The story had become viral content, a minor sensation in the business press. Waitress confronts wealthy father at gala. Multilingual woman exposes corporate fraud daughter, reveals shipping mogul's secrets. The headlines varied, but the core story remained consistent. The exposure felt overwhelming, like standing naked in a crowded room. I had spent years building a private life, and now my face appeared in articles read by thousands. Text messages from Lucy arrived in rapid succession. "Maya, what happened?" "I just saw the video." "5 languages you never told me about Mandarin. Are you okay? Call me when you can." I was not ready to call anyone. The isolation I had cultivated for protection now felt brittle. The email from Silvercrest Hall's Human Resources Department arrived mid-morning, requesting a meeting at my earliest convenience. The formal language suggested consequences I could not predict. I responded with an offer to come in that afternoon, then forced myself to eat breakfast. The meeting with HR proved surprisingly supportive. The ballroom manager attended as well, vouching for my character and work history. "We have received numerous inquiries about the incident," the HR representative explained. "Most have been from media outlets. We will not be providing any statements. Your privacy is important to us." "Thank you. However, we must ask whether you intend to continue in your current position. Given the attention some of our regular guests may find your presence complicated." I understood immediately. Wealthy patrons might not want to be served by someone who had demonstrated the ability to understand their private conversations and the willingness to reveal sensitive information. "I understand," I said. "Perhaps a transition period would be appropriate." "We would like to offer you a reference and 2 months of severance. Your performance here has been exemplary, and these circumstances are beyond the normal scope of employment conflicts." The manager spoke up. "You should know that several guests have asked about you since last night, not with complaints, with interest. A representative from an international consulting firm left her card with specific instructions to forward it to you. The card belonged to someone named Catherine Reyes. The firm specialized in cross-border negotiations and multilingual corporate communications, exactly the kind of work my education had prepared me for. I left Silvercrest Hall with hope. The destruction of my anonymity might open doors that had previously been closed. My phone rang as I reached the bus stop. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize, but instinct told me to answer. Ms. Sullivan, this is Agent Chen from the Division of Financial Integrity. We would like to speak with you about the information you shared last evening at the Heritage Global Gala. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and concluded with an appointment for a formal interview the following day. The DFI had apparently been investigating Kingsley Freight for months, building a case that remained incomplete. My publicly shared observations had provided additional avenues for inquiry. You are not in any legal jeopardy, Agent Chen assured me. We simply want to understand what you observed and when. I agreed to the interview without hesitation. Ethan called 3 times that afternoon. I let each call go to voicemail, then listened to his increasingly desperate messages. Maya, this is completely insane. You have to tell them you exaggerated. You have to fix this. Dad is losing everything. The investors are pulling out. The regulators are circling. This is your fault. Call me back. We need to talk. You owe me that much. I owed him nothing. Whatever debt might have existed between siblings had been canceled by years of his complicity in our father's contempt. The formal interview at the DFI offices took place in a conference room with 3 investigators and a court reporter. I walked through everything I had observed during my time at Silvercrest, the German executives, the Spanish businessmen, the Japanese client. The investigators asked detailed questions about dates, names, and specific phrases I remembered. My linguistic training proved useful here. What changed last night? The lead investigator asked. My father publicly humiliated me in front of his business associates. He called me uneducated, useless, low class. I realized that remaining silent was another form of accepting his assessment, so I spoke. Your information has been valuable, the lead investigator said finally, and we should mention that Kingsley Freight's board of directors has voted to suspend Jacob Kingsley pending the outcome of a forensic audit. The timeline has accelerated significantly since your public statements. I absorbed this news without any visible reaction. The consequences of my words were accumulating faster than I had imagined. My father's empire was falling. The man who had told me I would never amount to anything was watching his own achievements collapse while the daughter he despised became a central figure in his downfall. This was not revenge. I had simply stopped protecting him from the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was more powerful than anything he had ever built. The days following my DFI interview brought an avalanche of developments. The story of the gala confrontation had transformed into something larger, amplified by media attention. Business journalists dug into Kingsley Freight's financial records. Regulatory agencies announced expanded investigations. Former employees came forward with additional allegations. I observed these developments from my apartment, fielding calls from reporters and messages from strangers. The exposure was overwhelming. I had spent years cultivating invisibility, and now my face appeared in articles read by thousands. Lucy flew up from California, arriving at my door with groceries. You look terrible, she said as a way of greeting. When did you last eat a real meal? I told her about the DFI interview and the strange sensation of becoming known after years of anonymity. 5 languages, she said, mixing soup that smelled of ginger and chicken. You have been holding out on me. I did not think it mattered. It matters now. What you did at that gala took real courage. Sometimes breaking is the same thing as courage. As I ate, I told her about the consulting firm that contacted me. They specialize in international negotiations, the kind of work I always imagined doing. And you are hesitating because I do not want my career to begin as a footnote to my father's scandal. I want to be hired for my abilities, not my notoriety. Lucy nodded. Your abilities are exactly what got you noticed. The scandal just provided the platform. You spent a decade becoming excellent at something. Now people know about it. Ethan appeared at my apartment that evening, his arrival announced by frantic knocking. He looked worse than I felt, his expensive clothes wrinkled, his composure eroded by stress. "You have to help me," he said without preamble. "Dad is going to lose everything. The board suspended him. The investors are suing. There is talk of criminal charges." "I am aware." "So fix it. Tell them you exaggerated. Tell them you misunderstood." I stepped back from the doorway, keeping distance between us. Lucy watched from the kitchen. "Ethan, I cannot say what I said, and even if I could, it would not matter. The investigation was already underway before the gala. My statements simply accelerated processes that were going to happen regardless." "You do not know that." "The DFI told me directly. They had been building a case for months." He slumped against the wall. "I do not understand any of this. Dad never told me anything about how the company actually worked. I just showed up for meetings and smiled for photographs." "I know. How can you know you were not there? You abandoned the family years ago." "I left because there was no place for me. You and Dad made that very clear. Every achievement I earned was dismissed. I built a life without you because you gave me no other option." He stared at me, then offered an apology. "I am sorry. For how I treated you. For laughing when Dad made fun of you. For never standing up for you." "I do not need your apology," I said finally, "but I appreciate that you offered it. What I need is for you to understand that I am not the villain in this story. Dad's choices created these consequences. I simply stopped hiding them." He left shortly afterward, diminished. The meeting with Catherine Reyes from the consulting firm took place in a glass-walled office overlooking Elliott Bay. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the direct manner of someone who had succeeded through competence. "Your demonstration at the gala was impressive," she said. "It was intended as survival." "Even better. People who perform well under pressure are exactly what we need." She outlined the position junior analyst in their international communications division, leveraging my language skills and cultural knowledge. The salary was substantial. "I have to be honest," I said. "I am concerned about being defined by what happened with my father. I want to be valued for my abilities." Catherine nodded. "I am not offering you this position because of the gala. I am offering it because you demonstrated abilities that are genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. The gala simply made us aware of your existence." I accepted the position 3 days later. The work would be challenging, the expectations high. But for the first time in my life, I would be operating in spaces where my skills were recognized rather than dismissed. The news of my new position coincided with developments in my father's case. Forensic auditors had discovered systematic manipulation of financial records, including falsified export documentation. The regulatory investigation had expanded to include potential criminal referrals. Jacob Kingsley's empire was falling. I read the reports, unable to feel satisfaction in his destruction, even as I recognized the justice of his accountability. He had built his success on fraudulent foundations, and those foundations were collapsing under the weight of scrutiny they had never been designed to bear. The man who had told me I would never amount to anything was watching his own legacy crumble, while the daughter he despised began building something real. It simply felt like truth finally acknowledged. The criminal charges against my father were announced on a Tuesday morning, delivered through a press conference by a federal prosecutor whose measured tone could not disguise the significance of what she was describing. 15 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of falsifying financial documents, 6 counts of conspiracy to defraud international trading partners. The list continued for several minutes, each charge another brick in the wall being constructed around Jacob Kingsley's remaining years. I watched the coverage from my new office at the consulting firm, the glass walls providing a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline that still felt surreal after years of working in basements and back rooms. Catherine had assigned me to a team handling Korean-American trade negotiations work that required exactly the cultural fluency and linguistic precision I had spent a decade developing. The news channels replayed footage of my father being escorted from his home by federal agents, his wrists secured, his expression hollow. He wore the same confident suit he had worn to the gala, but the man inside it had visibly diminished. The authority that had defined him throughout my childhood had been stripped away, leaving someone smaller than I remembered. Ethan stood beside the family lawyers, his face carefully composed for cameras. He had called me twice since the charges were announced, leaving voicemails I had not yet returned. His messages were different now, less demanding, more subdued, as though recent events had finally penetrated his assumptions about how the world worked. The forensic audit had been devastating. Investigators uncovered systematic patterns of fraud stretching back decades. My father had built his logistics empire on misrepresented contracts, falsified customs documents, and payments to officials who looked the other way. The investors he had courted were suing for recovery of funds. Former employees were coming forward with stories of intimidation and retaliation. Everything I had suspected had proven to be substantially accurate. The picture was actually worse than my limited observations had suggested. "You are distracted today," Catherine observed during our afternoon meeting. Understandable given circumstances. The destruction of my family's legacy is far-reaching, and processing those realities takes time. I will maintain focus, but the circumstances are challenging to my equilibrium. That was not a criticism. I was acknowledging that this situation would challenge anyone's equilibrium. Your father's downfall is public and dramatic. You played a role in initiating that downfall. Processing those realities takes time. I do not know what I expected, I admitted. When I spoke at the gala, I was reacting to humiliation, not calculating consequences. The scale of what has happened since then exceeds anything you anticipated. Considerably. Catherine leaned back in her chair. The question you need to answer is whether you regret speaking, not whether you regret the consequences. Those were beyond your control, but the decision itself, the choice to stop hiding what you knew. I considered the question. I do not regret speaking, I said finally. I regret that speaking was necessary. I regret that my father chose to build something that could not survive honesty, but the act of speaking itself that I do not regret. Good. Catherine nodded. That clarity will be tested repeatedly as this process continues. You need to know in your own heart why you made the choice you made. The meeting with my mother happened the following weekend in a neutral location. She had suggested a coffee shop in a Portland neighborhood. I had not seen her since leaving home years earlier. Eliza Kingsley looked smaller than I remembered, her hair more gray, her posture more curved. Maya, she said my name like a question. Hello, Mom. We sat across from each other. I ordered coffee. She requested tea. I did not know, she said, the words emerging in a rush, about the fraud, the lies, any of it. Your father kept everything separate. I believed him because believing was easier than questioning. I understand. I spent our entire marriage not asking questions. When he dismissed you, when he treated you as though you did not matter, I stayed silent. I told myself that keeping peace was more important than making trouble. You survived the way you knew how. That is not an excuse. I am ashamed of the mother I was. I watched my daughter build herself from nothing while I did nothing to help. She wiped at her eyes with a paper napkin. And now, seeing who you are, I am ashamed of myself. I let her words settle. I am not asking for an apology or explanation, I said. But if you want to know who I am, who I became despite everything, I am willing to show you, slowly, carefully. She nodded, tears flowing freely now. That is more than I deserve. Perhaps, but it is what I am offering. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about the lawyers trying to separate her finances from his criminal liability, about the life she was trying to rebuild. I told her about my education, my languages, and my new position. I described the years of struggle that had made me the person I had become. By the time we parted, something had shifted. Not resolution, but possibility. The news that evening confirmed what everyone had expected. My father would face trial on all charges. His legal team had attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but prosecutors had declined. Jacob Kingsley's empire had not merely fallen. It had been systematically dismantled, every fraudulent brick removed and catalogued. The man who had built it would spend years defending himself against the consequences of his choices, and the daughter he had dismissed as worthless would watch it happen while building something real, something honest, something that could survive the light of scrutiny. That was not revenge. It simply felt like truth, finally given room to exist. The morning of my father's sentencing arrived with unexpected calm. Seattle's gray skies offered neither judgment nor absolution, merely the familiar comfort of Pacific Northwest weather, doing what it had always done. I woke early, made coffee, and allowed myself an hour of quiet reflection before the day demanded attention. The trial had lasted 6 weeks. I had testified twice, providing context for observations I had made during my time at Silvercrest Hall. The prosecutors had treated me with professional respect. The defense attorneys had attempted to portray me as a bitter daughter motivated by family grievances. Neither characterization captured the full truth. My father had been convicted on 12 of the 15 counts against him. The evidence was overwhelming, not merely my testimony, but documents, financial records, statements from former employees, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of decades-long fraud. The forensic accountants had done their work thoroughly. The courthouse was surrounded by the media when I arrived. Catherine had offered to accompany me, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone. The sentencing hearing proceeded with the formal ritual of criminal justice. Victims provided impact statements. Character witnesses attempted to humanize a man who had been reduced to his worst choices. The judge delivered her sentence with measured gravity. 84 months in federal prison. Restitution in amounts that would likely consume whatever assets remained after civil judgments. Supervised release extending years beyond his potential lifespan. Jacob Kingsley received this news without visible reaction. Whatever he felt in that moment remained hidden behind the mask he had worn throughout his life. I watched him being escorted from the courtroom, his wrists secured, his future determined by choices he had made decades before anyone confronted him with their consequences. The man who had told me I would never amount to anything was being led away to face accountability for the empire he had built on fraud. There was no satisfaction in this, no triumph. Only the strange, hollow peace of watching something end that should never have existed in the first place. Ethan found me outside the courthouse, his appearance suggesting months of sleepless nights and difficult adjustments. He had taken a position with a small freight company in Tacoma, entry-level work that would teach him the business his father had never trusted him to learn. "It is over," he said. The legal portion is over. The rest continues. I do not know what that means. It means that life does not stop at convenient, dramatic moments. Dad goes to prison. Mom rebuilds what she can. You learn to work for a living. I continue developing my career. The story continues even when the chapter ends. He nodded slowly, absorbing this. I am trying to understand why you spoke that night at the gala. I spoke because I was tired of being silent, because he humiliated me one time too many times, because I had information that people deserve to know. Do you regret it? I regret that it was necessary. I regret that our father built something that could not survive honesty. I regret the pain this has caused people who did not deserve it. But the act of speaking the choice to stop hiding what I knew that I do not regret. Ethan accepted this without argument. I want to try, he said, to have some kind of relationship. I know I was terrible to you for years, but you are my sister, and I am trying to become someone better. Then try. I cannot promise anything, but I can promise to notice if you succeed. We parted outside the courthouse siblings, whose shared blood had never translated into shared experience. The distance between us remained vast. The evening found me at Silvercrest Hall, not as an employee but as a guest. Catherine had arranged the dinner to celebrate my promotion to senior analyst, a recognition of work that had exceeded expectations during my first year with the firm. The ballroom where I had once served water now hosted a gathering where I was welcomed as a colleague and equal. The sophisticated lighting still caught the polished surfaces. The wealthy patrons still conducted their careful dance of influence and aspiration. But I moved through these spaces differently now, visible and valued in ways I had once only imagined. Lucy had flown up for the occasion, her presence a reminder of friendships that had sustained me through difficulty. We found a quiet moment near the fountain entrance where I had once stood in my waitress uniform. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Surreal. 18 months ago, I was serving these people water. Now I am negotiating contracts they depend on. You earned this. Everything that has happened since the gala, you earned it by being excellent at something difficult. I know. I am just adjusting to the reality of being seen. She smiled, understanding what I meant. What comes next? She asked. More work, more growth. Eventually, perhaps the doctoral program in corporate ethics I have been considering. The field needs people who understand how fraud happens and why people allow it to continue. The dinner proceeded through its elegant courses. I made conversation with partners and senior analysts, demonstrating the social fluency I had developed through years of observation. The evening felt like validation, not of the confrontation, but of the decade of preparation that had preceded it. Walking home afterward through streets still damp from earlier rain, I allowed myself to consider the full arc of what had happened. My father was in prison. My mother was rebuilding her life. My brother was learning to become something more than a prop. And I was finally living the existence I had spent years preparing for. The truth had cost me my family, but it had also given me freedom. Freedom from the silence that had constrained me. Freedom from the pretense that loyalty required protecting fraud freedom to become whoever I chose to be. Standing on the bridge where I often walked to think, watching lights reflect off water, I understood finally what the past 18 months had taught me. Silence is not peace. It is simply a delayed confrontation. Speaking truth is simply refusing to carry weight that belongs to others. And becoming visible after years of enforced invisibility is simply claiming the space that was always rightfully mine. If you found something in this story that resonated with your own experience, if you have been dismissed or overlooked or told you would never amount to anything, I hope you remember this. The people who underestimate you do so from their own limitations, not from accurate assessment of your potential. Build yourself anyway, learn anyway, grow anyway. And when the moment comes to speak, speak.